as you should. Let me just, those of us who went to law school but didn't do as well as Lisa Graves, did learn that you should always say after something very impressive has been said that I associate myself with the remarks of Ms. Graves. And I do associate myself with the remarks of Lisa, who just gave us, I think, a tremendous presentation on the fundamentals. And before we get going too far, I want to say that it is a tremendous honor to be on a panel with Ray McGovern, and for a reason that is probably won't be discussed sufficiently today, and that is that back in 2005, roughly, after the 2004 election, I came to the conclusion that I was going to do something that no other major writer for national publication did, and nobody else who does TV or a lot of other media did, and that was that somebody had to stand up and say explicitly and consistently again and again and again that George Bush and Dick Cheney needed to be impeached for their violations of the Constitution. And I want to say that throughout that struggle, and we went to, I went to the better part of 30 states, did a lot of work on that, and consider it to have been a wholly successful struggle, because impeachments are never completed, right? If you ever do get to the edge of impeaching them, they get on a plane like Richard Nixon and head out, right? So the fact is, impeachments are very rare. The point of an impeachment is a checking and a balancing of illicit, illegal, unconstitutional power. And so it's the building of the movement that matters the most. And it started very small, but there before me and with me throughout the struggle, and too many panels to even count, was my comrade Ray McGovern, who stood up and really put that issue in the context of the military. And I will say one final note on impeachment, which is still the best single tool to stop wars. The single best tool, I want to bluntly tell you. You want to talk about stopping a war? Take the commander-in-chief out of his position. And the group that was actually campaigning for impeachment before I was speaking up on it was Veterans for Peace. That got it from the very beginning. And Leah, who served 20 years in the Navy, in all sorts of different countries, never allowed to be involved in combat because she was a woman, is somebody who probably ought to, we should have started out with, you're too generous a moderator. Right. You know, tell us your story, and at some point we should get that in the mix here, because it's important. Well, no, it's more than just to be nice to you. It is that one of the things we forget about as regards the military-industrial complex is that there are two innocent players in the military-industrial complex. Two innocent groups of players. Number one, citizens, right? Citizens today, and I'll talk about this mostly in my remarks, citizens are not a part of starting wars anymore. They don't start it. Wars begin completely beyond the bounds of the Constitution, beyond the bounds of law, beyond the bounds of democracy and citizenship. So citizens become bystanders. But I will argue also that soldiers and sailors and pilots become bystanders. And I'll tell you, I know that we will have the moral discussion and the appropriate moral discussion about should you not serve in an illegal and immoral, wrong-headed war. But let us, we ought not delink the economic reality from the military. And you know that right now the military has the most successful recruitment in modern history going on. The most successful recruitment in modern history right now. They are maxing out all their recruitment goals. They are actually finally turning down all sorts of people who lack the educational attainment, who lack physical skills that they used to take. Why? Because we have 10% official unemployment and 17% real unemployment in the United States. We are driving people into the military and making them bystanders to the decisions of the military-industrial complex. They get sent to fight and die in wars that were not legally launched, that are not supported by the people of the United States, and frankly that they know should not be fought. And yet they've been driven there by economic reality. So we can have all of our moralism. I'm a Quaker. I'm really good at moralism. As good as they come. But I'm going to tell you, I understand the reality of a kid who doesn't have a job and is actually hungry and says, okay, that's it. I wanted to do something else. I put in 100 applications. I'm going down to the recruitment office. So, two groups that we have made bystanders in this process. Our soldiers and our citizens. So let's talk about if that's the way it's supposed to be. The most important thing, I think, to understand about this whole discussion is that America got a lot wrong at its founding. America was not founded perfectly, despite what Michelle Bachmann will tell you. It was not founded in some sort of, virgin birth, despite what Rick Perry will tell you. No, I'm serious. These guys, if you look at their talk about the founding of the United States, it's so pristine and perfect. Right? It's a sort of a Judeo-Christian, although I don't take the Judeo part all that seriously. Basically, it's like a good, whomping, nice fundamentalist moment there where, the finger reaches out from above and suddenly taps one little bit of turf out along the east coast of this continent and says, well, that's it, God's own country. And then there you go, pristine, perfect founding. Now, we screwed up a lot at the founding, and the founders were very conscious of it. Number one screw up, African Americans are 3/5 of a human being. I'm always wondering about that calculus. Right? Now, why not, 3/4? Why not 1/2? Well, as we know from South Africa, a country founded not founded in such original sin, but then evolved toward it, that your racists actually are very meticulous people. No, they're very precise about how they practice their racism. And so the 3/5 was a conscious number. It was chosen because you wanted to count 3/5 of an African American. That allowed southern states to have the proper proportion of congressional representation. So that we actually counted black people, slaves, as 3/5 of a human so that the southern states could dominate our policy making. Isn't that interesting? Now we use voter ID laws and other procedures to make sure that the southern states continue to dominate our national policies without allowing people of color, low-income people, students, and the elderly to vote. So we haven't progressed quite as far as we thought. But the one thing we got right at the founding, and this is a really cool thing, this is like the best thing going. I mean, we ought to be like popping champagne corks on this one and proud to be Americans because of the damn French and Indian War. Remember that French and Indian War? How did the French and Indian War get fought on American soil? I don't know. You would have thought maybe France. But, sort of like there was like this great imperialist war, right? You go fight it someplace else. Well, the French and Indian War was a horrible, stupid war. And it was between the British, the Indians were bystanders, again, largely, but it was between the British and the French. And they fought it on American soil. And they dragooned the Americans into it, made Americans fight it. They didn't like fighting it. They also didn't like a lot of the aspects of it. And then when it got done, it was really, really expensive. And so King George, who had not, the United States operated as sort of an autonomous colony. The British wanted to settle this place. And so they didn't tax it much. They said, go out there, the third son who's not going to inherit the property, in England, go over to the United States, the criminal who wanted to escape debtor's prison. You go over there, and you pretty much do what you want. We aren't going to bother with it. But the French and Indian War cost a whole lot of money. And so King George started imposing taxes on the United States, on these colonies. And it is actually where you got that tax on tea. Right? And the whole Tea Party, which by the way was a revolutionary act against a corporation, not a rally, with a bunch of people wearing, colonial hats. And, but the thing to recognize there is they had an experience of a military-industrial complex. And so the founders, having been dragooned into unnecessary war, having seen their lives upset by it in all sorts of fundamental ways, having seen taxation imposed on them, and a loss of liberty related to it, decided, we're not going there. The one thing that will separate us and make us different than the old countries of Europe, than the kingdoms of Europe, is going to be an understanding that we will not allow our executive to become a king who leads us into unnecessary, illegal, immoral, and expensive wars that undermine our liberties. That was the whole point. The whole point of vast sections of the Constitution of the United States. It was drawn as one member of that great, it wasn't a Congress, it was a convention in the summer of 1787, said that the point of the Constitution, not the point of the section, the point of the entire document, was to chain the dogs of war. To chain the dogs of war. That was why we wrote a Constitution. And what did we do in that Constitution? If you read the document again and again and again, the document itself says, at every turn, we want to make it very, very hard for you to go to war. Presidents cannot launch wars. That is not a power given to the president in any sense. I know I'm starting to sound more and more like Michelle Bachmann here. What power does a president have? Well, the president does not have a power to launch us into a war. Doesn't. It does not exist. Presidents can't do that. Congress has to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop to do it. Do you know that in the Constitution of the United States, the Congress is supposed to revisit a war every 2 years? So it's to sit down and have a serious discussion every 2 years, and it's in there. Why are we having this war? Should we be spending this money? Should we be doing it? And you want to know how seriously it was taken at the start? It's my favorite story. During the War of 1812, and I kind of like that, naming wars after years. It's cool, right? The War of 1812, because you can remember it. We are now currently in the War of 2001 in Afghanistan and the War of 2003 in Iraq, although it's really a footnoted War of 1991 via 2003. But the War of 1812 was a really stupid war. And it's good to start. If you're going to start a war, start with a stupid one. And it was incredibly stupid. We're like this little country, and we're like the punk kid on the playground. We're like, hey, we're going to take over Canada. And the British are like, no, you're not. And so we're like actually trying to maneuver to take over Canada, and the British are like, no, you don't get to have Canada. And so we had a war. And it was a stupid war that faced massive opposition. There was passionate opposition. New England threatened to secede from the United States in opposition to the War of 1812. They had a huge convention. Prominent people whose names you know were advocates for secession because they didn't want to be in this stupid war. Then, the war got more serious. It moved toward Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. The British had a better army. And they'd actually figured out how to fight on American soil in those days. So they fought, and they were moving toward the capital. Alexander Cockburn, nation writer Alexander Cockburn's great-great-great-great-great-great-uncle, I believe, actually burned the White House. And it's in Alex's wonderful book. And there's a pit, they got a drawing of a guy who looks a little like Alex running away with a torch. He was a British commander. And so the War of 1812 got pretty damn serious, right? It got to the capital. It got to the capital city. They're burning the White House. And do you know what happened when the British were firing on and burning the White House? The U.S. Senate was debating whether to continue funding the war. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. And continued funding of the war won by 2 votes. As the capital of the United States was being fired on, an overwhelming portion of the Congress was saying, defund it. Stop funding the war and stop the damn thing. Because this was an illicit and wrong-headed war. That was how seriously this thing was taken. They were 2 years in, it was 1814. They were having their 2-year assessment of the war, and a substantial number of people were saying, let's stop it. We don't do that anymore. When was the 2-year assessment of Iraq? When was the 2-year assessment of Afghanistan? You know, we would now, on Iraq, technically, we would be, and my math isn't as good as Lisa's, but we would be on something like the 10th 2-year assessment of Iraq now. Right? And if we did that, if it was a formal thing, it would give us, we who oppose these wars, an opportunity to organize and focus, make demands. It would be a wonderful tool, and it's in our Constitution. But Michelle Bachmann keeps missing that part. So, the wonderful thing is that we maintained this passion, this understanding. It wasn't just, this isn't just a thing for people with tricorner hats. well up into the 20th century, this was a very well understood requirement of American citizenship to be an anti-imperialist. Now, I know that now when we use the term imperialism, it sounds like, oh, we've got to get a Che Guevara cap, and it's got to. So, no, anti-imperialism is not some foreign concept. Anti-imperialism is a deeply rooted American concept, and anti-imperialism was deep-rooted and hardwired into the political life and the citizen life of this country. Do you know that as late as the early 1900s, on Washington's birthday, in communities across the United States, small towns across the United States, they would have readings, sometimes attended by thousands of people, of Washington's farewell address, which closes off with saying, avoid entangling alliances. Right? This whole expression of why we shouldn't get involved in all sorts of foreign wars, foreign trade agreements, which have done so much damage to our domestic industries, and they would read it every year as a reacquaintance with the point of the American experiment. And so where did we kind of break where did it break? Well, it started to break with the wonderfully named Spanish-American War, right? Much like the French and Indian War. It wasn't fought in Spain or America, it was fought in other places where we battled over our colonies. And America ended up out of that war with a whole bunch of colonies. The Philippines. They were not happy to be a part of the United States. And so we actually had our first revolt against a colony then. But you saw at that point a wonderful debate. One of the great debates in American history. Only time we actually had a real election solely on imperialism and on these questions. The 1900 election between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley. And Bryan's statements in that were, there's nothing the most radical person in this room will say that will rival what the Democratic nominee for President of the United States said in 1900 about imperialism, about going out and launching these wars. What Madison said at that time was an echo, or what Bryan said was an echo of what James Madison had said. Now, I'll just read you a quick note here on that, because it is such, Madison's wonderful line at the founding was, in spite of all the claims and examples of patriotism, let's underline that for a second. In spite of all the claims and examples of patriotism, oh, wave the flag, oh yeah, which ought by no means to be underestimated, the testimony of all ages forces us to admit that war is the most dangerous of all enemies to liberty. War is the most dangerous of all enemies to liberty. Liberty cannot long survive in a state of perpetual war. That was James Madison, the author of the Constitution, essential founding father as regards the Bill of Rights. You can't do it. The American experiment doesn't work. It cannot function in a state of perpetual war. When did we lose sight of that then? Okay? Spanish-American War, we had a battle over it, we went the wrong way. World War I, war faced with massive opposition, again, took the wrong choice. Actually, I happen to be, I'm a Quaker, but I'm a lousy Quaker. I happen to think that World War II was an okay war. And I didn't like it. I lost a great uncle in it. I lost a lot of cousins and relatives in it. Don't like it for that regard, but I actually think fighting fascism, not a bad idea. But here's the interesting thing. I think the critical point as regards to development of the military-industrial complex came at this point of great celebration, VE Day and VJ Day. Because we had won. We had won, not pretty, not pleasant, a nuclear bomb, but still, that war had been concluded. And American troops were being ferried home from around the world. The Merchant Marine, the only unionized, and I would mention communist unionized branch of the military, the Merchant Marine, National Maritime Union, was racing back and forth all around the world to bring the soldiers home. Bring the guns home. Let's get this done with. Let's bury this whole complex of war and empire building. Let's come on home. And there was a wonderful moment. There's a ship called the SS Lexington. And if you haven't read the story of it, it's worth a movie. The NMU guys, National Maritime Union guys, out on the SS Lexington were sent to bring troops from the islands of the South Pacific home. Say, come on home, guys. The war is done. We're not going to fight anymore. We're going to beat our swords into plowshares. And so they were picking up soldiers, and they got a cable that said, you got to divert. You got to divert from picking up U.S. soldiers and bringing them home, because there are groups of French soldiers that need to be taken to Indochina. We got to take them to these ports in Haiphong. And so the SS Lexington guys, you know, diverted. They took their orders, and they picked up the French troops, and they landed them. And of course, being the good sailors that they were, they headed into the bars. And they're hanging out in the taverns, the bars, in the ports of what would become Vietnam. And when they hung out, being the good socialists and communists that they were, they looked up the local socialists and communists. And they ran into Ho Chi Minh's friends. Isn't that interesting? This kind of wild moment of our history. And so they're in the bars, hanging out, having a drink, saying, well, we just brought some French down to teach you guys a lesson or two. And the Vietnamese said, oh, that's going to be really bad because the French are colonial. They're going to try and maintain a colonial power. And the NMU guys are like, what? You know? Says, yeah, they're trying to colonize. They're trying to, you know, and they're like, well, what's that about? He says, oh, we're fighting a war. And you know who our inspiration is? George Washington. Thomas Jefferson. Ho Chi Minh was a cook in a Chinese restaurant in New York City in the 1920s. He studied the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. He studied Jefferson and Madison, and he went home to Vietnam and said, let's have a country like that. And any of you guys are like, this does not sound right. You made a mistake here. And they're saying, do you want to see our Declaration of Independence? And they're like looking at it, and they're getting it's a little more and more sweaty, because it reads just like the American Declaration of Independence. And they're like, Jesus, we brought colonial soldiers here and they cabled President Truman from Vietnam. The NMU guys, they cabled President Truman. And they said, we object to ferrying colonial soldiers to put down a revolution based on the values of our American Revolution. We object to our being used to be doing this. We should be bringing troops home, not spreading the virus of war into the next period of this world's life. That was 1945. And I want to emphasize to you, those were Americans. Those were Americans in the Madison and Jeffersonian tradition. They got exactly what their duty was. It was to object to empire and to imperialism. And I'm going to close off with just a couple of quick things from 1945. I'm not going to bring you up to a particular contemporary moment, because I actually think we're doing a lousy job now. I really do. I'm very disappointed in our current moment. I am deeply disappointed. Because in 1945, first off, right before World War II, Robert M. La Follette Jr., the son of Bob La Follette, said on the floor of the Senate, modern war cannot be fought under democratic control. Modern war cannot be fought under democratic control. It requires dictatorship for total control. That's 1940, before World War II. So modern war cannot be fought under democratic control. We fought the war. At the close of the war, and that's one of my objections that people would say, oh, we can, you know, democratize warfare. You can't. It's not going to happen. You're not going to democratize war. You democratize the choice of whether to have war or not war itself. So, but after the war was done, La Follette, still in the Senate, took to the floor of the Senate, 1945, May of 1945. Still, this is before the bomb had been dropped on Japan. He says, unless we change our direction soon, we shall find that our fantastic expenditure of men, money, and materials has brought us only a short and uneasy truce, not the enduring peace we pray for and seek. May 31st, 1945 says, unless we change our course soon, none of what we did is going to end war. We're going to perpetuate war. And decisions made in that period from 1945 to 1950, I believe, absolutely perpetuated war. And have laid the groundwork for where we're at now. And there are things that we ought to address and think about. Number one, I love the United Nations. Big fan of the United Nations. But when the Congress of the United States in 1945 voted, and then repeated again and again, that we would put our troops under the command of UN missions. We created a situation where, used by Harry Truman in 1950, we could go into undeclared war. Our first undeclared modern war, the Korean War, was launched because we were part of the UN. And Harry Truman said, oh, we're part of the UN. The UN's going to go do this nice little war in Korea. We're going along with it. Well, that was one of the worst losses of our sovereignty. We should not, there should be a clarification. We do not join UN wars simply because of something voted on in 1945. And you want to know how current this is? How current this is? Our undeclared war in Libya, which by the way is going to be a long and messy situation, in which we're going to have problems there for a very long time. Our undeclared war in Libya was fought under that UN bridge, right? So we did something in 1945 that sticks with us today because we ceded our authority to stop war. We ceded our authority as citizens to say we can't do this. So that's the number one thing. I mean, I love the UN. It's not that I'm a basher of the UN. I'm just saying we ought to be respectful participants. And if the UN's launching a war, right, no matter where, we ought to have a declaration of war vote before our troops can join in that war. It is in our Constitution, and our joining of the UN, in my opinion, does not in any way supersede the Constitution of the United States. That's number one. Number two, I think it's absolutely important for our peace movements, our anti-war movements, to become constitutional movements. You know, one of the biggest problems we have is that the growth of the military-industrial complex, the expansion of the military-industrial complex, is rooted in the fact that we don't declare our wars anymore. And undeclared wars become dramatically expansive, easy things to take to places that they should not go. And so, what I would suggest in closing is just this very simple concept. Very simple concept. A country that was founded in opposition to perpetual war, that drew up a constitution that did not permit perpetual war, ought to return to that concept via a movement that is a constitutional movement. And in this, we have to, I close with this kind of critical point, we have to recognize that this cannot be a movement of the left. This is not about the left. This has got to be a left-right movement. And the fact of the matter is that Ron Paul, who I disagree with on so many fundamental issues, is the one guy who's got it spot on as regards declaration of war. Give Ron Paul his due. And give Dennis Kucinich his due. And understand that as we talk about war, and as we talk about doing this, we need to become absolutists, not pacifists. People can choose whether to be pacifists. But we need to become absolutists about the very simple concept. Are we fighting a war that is legal and legitimate under our Constitution? The fact of the matter is we have not done that. We have not done that since World War II. We have not had a declared war since World War II. And we need to get comfortable with saying that it is un-American. It is un-American to fight an undeclared war. It is unconstitutional. And I want us to be back in the middle of that debate, not to be the citizen bystanders. And so I'll tell you, my favorite part of the whole thing was the Ludlow Amendment. Who knows about the Ludlow Amendment? One person here, a couple people. The Ludlow Amendment, back in the late 1930s, the Ludlow Amendment to the Constitution said, if we are not attacked, then the citizens of the United States must be consulted via a national referendum before we launch any new war. And you say, well, that is the kind of thing you hear about at a democracy convention in Madison, Wisconsin in the summer of 2011. Very romantic, very sweet. The Ludlow Amendment came within a handful of votes of passing the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937. That requirement of a referendum. And in polling in 1937, 73% of Americans supported the Ludlow Amendment. Said, we do not want to ever have a war again that is not voted on first by the American people. Now, you think, oh, well, 1937, that's a long time ago? I don't buy it. I do not buy it. I believe that if we moved and worked and campaigned on the argument that the American people should have a much deeper consultative role in the question of whether we go to war, that we would find that those numbers are still way better than we ever thought. There may not be an anti-war majority in America, but there is still a constitutional majority in America. The right understands it, but they don't understand the Constitution. We ought to seize our Constitution back and say, the founders were right. The founders were absolutely right. The point of our Constitution is to chain the dogs of war